Despite One Piece being such a battle-heavy series, most fans will cite the main appeal of the story as the world building, or perhaps the overarching plot, or the lovable characters, or the underlying mysteries, or really any number of other aspects that are more important than the actual fights. Just looking at the recent Reverie arc, hype for the series was at an all-time high without a single punch being thrown, as readers are so invested at this point in just seeing major political shifts in the One Piece world. But at the end of the day, One Piece is an action-adventure shonen, and so while all of that other stuff may add to our enjoyment of the series, we're all at least partly reading because we want to see superpowered characters beat the hell out of each other. As such, Oda can hit us with all the plot twists and lore and emotional backstories that he wants. All that drama still needs to culminate in some satisfying fights. So how good is Oda at that part of the story? What does he do well? What could be better? And most importantly, how does he think differently about fights than other mangaka? We're going to start with where he's not so strong. At the most basic level, just visually, One Piece's action is not as consistently clean or fluid as some of its rivals. That's not to say Oda can't draw great individual action shots when he tries. There are certainly other mangaka who surpass him in this regard, but at the very least, when Oda goes all in on a double-page spread, he can make it wallpaper-worthy. However, it's more so the action in between where Oda can get a little lazy. Now, Oda's choreography has certainly improved over the course of the series, and recently Chapter 895 featured one of the best continuous action sequences we've seen in One Piece so far. But even that still doesn't really compare to some pure martial arts manga when it comes to straight-up choreography. In particular, a problem that I still feel persists with One Piece's fights is that sometimes Oda uses more panels than necessary to communicate one interaction, so the action gets a little choppy. Now obviously there's more to fights than just how they look. For instance, Hunter x Hunter shines through how cerebral its fights can get. There is a great deal of nuance and complexity to its Nen combat system, giving readers a lot to think about as a fight progresses. However, strategy has never been One Piece's forte. While ability matchups and improvisation matter, for the most part Luffy really doesn't have to think that far beyond, say, using water to combat Crocodile's abilities, or utilizing a ricochet to counter Enel. Usopp and Nami's fights tend to feature the most strategy by One Piece's standards, but even those are hardly chess matches. The combat system has gotten a little more complex with the addition of Haki and the new rules that come with it, but at the end of the day the major fights are mostly brawls. And this brings me to my personal biggest issue with One Piece's fights, which is that in a world with such a wide range of extraordinary abilities, the fighting can be kind of one-dimensional. There is something to be said for series where the combatants have very diverse skill sets and can showcase a great variety of powers and interactions throughout a fight. In One Piece, the three guys who get the lion's share of the action are all brawlers with relatively limited skill sets. Yes, Luffy has a million techniques, but the vast majority are still basically different types of punches. Bigger punches, faster punches, bigger faster punches, twisted up punches, punches that snake around and hit you from behind, continuous punches, and so on. Zoro can cut people a million different ways, Sanji can kick people a million different ways, but their abilities aren't that varied. There are characters with more varied abilities mixed in, but fights like Law vs. Smoker or Ace vs. Blackbeard are more the exception than the norm. So if One Piece fights are somewhat unremarkable in these areas, what sets them apart? Not even necessarily what One Piece does better than other series, but simply what makes it stand out as different. So maybe One Piece fights don't have the most strategy involved, and maybe they don't showcase the greatest variety of abilities, but damn, One Piece fights are intense. Characters fight tooth and nail, breaking bones, coughing up blood, panting, struggling to stay standing on their feet, their eyes covered with heavy shading as they verge on passing out. Characters will often drop to the ground multiple times throughout the fight and seem out for the count, only to push themselves to get back up again. It's common for Luffy's fights to end with him being literally unable to move his body, and in need of several days of rest. Even seemingly minor fights can sometimes leave the Straw Hats beaten to a pulp. So why do this? Why make fights so brutal? Well, for one, it's arguably more dramatic. In theory, the more pain we see the hero fight through, the harder they struggle, the greater the difficulty they overcome, the more emotionally satisfying the victory. Now, whether Oda takes it too far sometimes may also be a fair criticism, but for a lot of readers, this dramatic flair is what makes One Piece fights exciting. But that aside, it's not just drama for the sake of drama. The fights are so intense because that's what the series is about. Everyone is trying to climb to the top of the pirate world, and thematically One Piece emphasizes that willpower and drive are the most essential qualities in this climb to the top. As such, the major fights of One Piece are essentially battles of will. That's why the idea that Oda is consistently trying to communicate in his fights is that the character has reached their limit and is using willpower to keep pushing themselves beyond their limit. Zoro's wounds are so severe he shouldn't be conscious. Luffy should have passed out from poison. Usopp has broken most of the bones in his body, yet they still force themselves to keep going. And this goes both ways. Opponents are often extremely strong-willed and push through tremendous amounts of damage themselves. Again, whether Oda pushes the envelope too far in terms of what is believable is a separate debate, but the point is that from his perspective, it seems like the essence of a great fight comes down to how can I best demonstrate the strength of will of the hero? An idea that is only becoming more and more blatant as Haki has been introduced. So all that being said, if intensity makes One Piece stand out as different from other series, how about an area where I believe One Piece is just straight up better than other series? One Piece excels in capturing the individuality of each Straw Hat through their fights. Now that probably sounds pretty vague. I mean, for any series we can expect that different characters are going to have different fighting styles, and we can expect different types of fights out of them. But what I'm talking about is more so how personalized the story of each Straw Hat fight is, because every fight is a small story in itself, and Oda seems to follow a unique story template for each of his main characters. While this template doesn't really apply to minor fights, for the most part these templates are pretty consistent. The easiest example to start with is Usopp. Every major Usopp fight follows a similar story arc, and that story arc is exclusive to his character. It starts with false bravado. Usopp is a boastful liar and acts a lot tougher than he is. As such, either leading up to the fight or in the first phase of the fight, Usopp tries to act like a hero. Of course, in reality, Usopp is a coward, and so when he inevitably feels overwhelmed and it all becomes too much, at some point in every one of his fights without fail, he tries to escape, whether it be by running away or simply playing dead. After this, Usopp goes through some sort of internal struggle, and whether because of guilt, anger, sense of responsibility, or simply cries for help, Usopp ultimately finds his resolve and forces himself to fight. But it's not that simple. Just because he decided to come back and fight in the end doesn't change the fact that he tried to run away first, and so Usopp must be punished for his cowardice. That's why the first thing that happens after the escape attempt is he takes an absolutely brutal beating. Usopp must go through a sort of karmic hell every time he gets into a serious fight, and it's arguably not just punishment for his cowardly behavior during the fight, but also for all of the bragging and boasting and lying he did before it. Finally, after going through this extreme punishment for his actions and essentially atoning for his sins, he may now have his moment of victory where he redeems himself. Nice little story, right? Now, not every Straw Hat's template is as dramatic, but you can still see the individuality. For instance, Sanji is clearly third to Luffy and Zoro in strength, however he makes up for that by being a good deal smarter than them, and often shines as one of the most resourceful members of the crew. As such, the template of a Sanji fight involves a bit of brains mixed in with brawn. His fights always begin with straight up physical combat. Partway through his fight, his opponent resorts to some sort of trickery or foul play. Kurobe attacked Sanji underwater when he was weakened. Mr. 2 took advantage of Sanji's inability to hit women. Absalom used invisibility and invisible weapons, and Jaibura tried to trick Sanji with a made-up story. Sanji is then forced to use his wits to solve the problem, covering Kurobe's gills, finding the weakness of Mr. 2's devil fruit, using salt to counter Absalom, and tricking Jaibura in response. After that's out of the way, the fight returns to fair physical combat, and Sanji wins. Interestingly, even with Straw Hats who have very few data points to work with, we can already roughly see a template Oda has in mind that he may keep using. For example, Franky only has 2 major fights, but they were both stubborn macho contests befitting Franky's manly nature, where both characters refuse to dodge and instead follow a my turn, your turn system. Your punch is weak, no your punch is weak, I can tank your attack, well I can tank your attack, and so on it goes until one person can't handle it. Even someone like Nami, who doesn't fight often, follows a really weirdly specific pattern in both her major fights. Initially, Nami is helpless while her opponent doesn't take her seriously and toys with her. Then Nami has a eureka moment where she figures something out, followed by using Fata Morgana, after which Nami takes control of the fight and sets up for a finishing blow. Only right before the finishing blow she takes one piercing injury and then lands her final attack. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about Luffy, since the last section of this video is going to be Luffy-centric for different reasons anyway, so I'll just say that the basic template of Luffy's fights is that they take place over multiple rounds. From the first time he faces any major arc boss to the point that he defeats him, they will fight several times. Sometimes this is spread out over the course of the entire arc, and other times it's just one extended showdown that's split into multiple segments with breaks in between. Again, this goes back to major themes of the series, willpower and tenacity, that Oda especially likes to communicate through Luffy's fights. The idea is that no matter how many times he is defeated, Luffy, like rubber, always bounces back. That's the problem that most villains have with Luffy in the first place, that no matter what they do, this guy just keeps coming back over and refuses to go away. There are also dramatic reasons for doing this. Luffy usually has no prior personal connection to the villain and is typically fighting on someone else's behalf. So fighting them over the course of multiple rounds throughout the arc helps build a more personal animosity leading up to the final bout. Not to mention, it's arguably more satisfying to see a character succeed after falling short multiple times. That's just part of what makes One Piece finales so powerful. And speaking of which, I mentioned earlier that there are other authors who can write more strategic fights, or more creative fights, or better choreographed fights, but I believe that no other mangaka has the concluding ability that Oda does, because Oda's conclusions always carry some greater meaning in the context of the broader story. I'm not saying that other series don't have cool, dramatic conclusions to fights. I'm not saying that other series don't communicate themes in the way that the fight is won. What I'm saying is that One Piece goes a step further. At the end of a major saga, the manner in which Luffy wins the fight, what the final blow does, tends to have a secondary effect beyond just winning the fight. And this extra act that Luffy does symbolically resolves some key thematic conflicts of the arc. The best illustration of what I mean is Luffy's final fight with Enel, which he wins by hitting Enel into the Golden Bell. Winning the fight by simultaneously ringing the bell carries a tremendous amount of significance beyond just defeating Enel, as this one moment ties together nearly every single thematic thread and conflict of the arc. To start with, the Skypiea saga centered around the theme of dreams, and not only the theme of dreams, but the romance of pursuing those dreams. Having faith in one's foolish pursuits even when everyone else would laugh at them is the essence of romance, and this is how the saga begins. As such, just as everyone laughed at Luffy's dream of finding the Sky Island, so too did people mock Cricket for believing in the Golden City. And so when Luffy finally concludes the saga by ringing the bell so emphatically that the sound resonates all the way down to the blue seas, it's proof that the Golden City exists, it's proof that the Sky Island exists, it's proof that the impossible can exist, that dreams can be a reality. It's essentially a climactic stamp of validation of romantic pursuits. At the same time, in a completely different vein, the ringing of the bell is the fulfillment of a promise. The promise between Kalgara and Nolan from 400 years ago. The promise that the Shandians made that they would always be there waiting for Nolan's return, welcoming him back with the ringing of a bell. A promise that had gone unfulfilled for 400 years where they were unable to return home. The ringing of the bell fulfills this inherited will passed from Kalgara all the way down through the centuries to Wiper to relight the fires of Shandia and keep the promise to Noland. Most importantly, the ringing of the bell signifies the end of war, as the entire conflict of the Skypiea saga revolved around the centuries-old tribal war between the Skypieans and Shandians, and it finally came to an end with the declaration of truce that the ringing of the bell represents. By setting things up such that Enel was the final barrier to ringing the bell, Oda was able to conclude the fight in a way that had many layers of impact on the story. While the ending to Luffy vs Enel has by far the most to unpack, looking at the final fights of other sagas, we can similarly see that there is almost always a secondary act Luffy is doing while defeating the villain, and that secondary act is thematically important to the story. In East Blue, the Arlong pirates had taken over Nami's hometown, terrorizing and ruling over the villagers for a decade with a seemingly unbreakable hold over them. As such, the arc ended with Luffy not only defeating Arlong, but simultaneously tearing all of Arlong Park to the ground in the process, symbolically bringing down the Arlong pirates' reign over the village. Crocodile was the criminal boss of a secret underground organization that was manipulating Alabasta. Luffy didn't just defeat Crocodile. Their final fight ended with Luffy punching the underground criminal boss upwards, out from the underground into the open world, bringing his shadowy schemes out into the light and literally exposing him and the truth of the conflict, resulting in the end of the war. Doflamingo, the celestial dragon, considered himself to be a god, and controlled and manipulated everyone from above. Luffy defeated him by sending the heavenly demon crashing down from the sky into the underworld where he belonged. This final attack not only caused the birdcage to disappear, but reduced the entire nation to rubble, symbolizing the end of Doflamingo's control and the birth of a new nation, a blank slate of freedom. Luffy vs. Hody followed a similar path, the only difference being Luffy stopped short of following all the way through at the end. Fishman Island's tragic history led to the creation of dangerous zealots like Hody and his crew, and things had gotten so bad that fishmen and mermen alike wanted a reset, to wipe Fishman Island's history clean, set everything back to zero, and start over again. Luffy nearly did just that, as his beatdown of Hody turned into a full-on assault on the most important piece of Fishman Island's history, and he would have likely destroyed it until the Sea Kings intervened. Now, it's not just how Oda is ending these fights, but where they end matters as well. This is a point where most series can be really lazy. Most authors don't seem to put that much thought into the setting of the fight, and a common trend is just going the Dragon Ball route of fighting in an open space area. Even large-scale blockbuster movies don't seem to put that much thought into what the location means. Note that sometimes a series might have a fight that takes place in a cool setting, but that's not necessarily the same as having a meaningful setting. In One Piece, the setting of the fight means something in the context of the overall conflict. Luffy vs. Arlong finished in Nami's room. Luffy fought the leader of the underground organization, Underground. Luffy fought God in the heavens. Luffy had to climb up 4 levels to face Doflamingo, another false god, at the top of King's Plateau. Luffy fought Hody in the sea despite what Hody believed about the inferiority of man in the water. Now, obviously there are a million fights throughout the series where Oda clearly doesn't put this same level of thought in the ending of the fight. However, for the major sagas, he's pretty consistent with all of this, with Luffy vs. Lucci being the only notable exception. At the end of the day, Oda wants Luffy to win in the most climactic way possible, but the ending shouldn't just be dramatic. The location, the context, the visuals, the aftermath, even the direction the villain flies can all be used to represent something about the resolution of the story's conflict. So when Oda says he doesn't know how Luffy will defeat Kaido, I get the sense he isn't being completely honest. I would bet that's actually one of the first things he thought of when planning the arc. Now, taking all this into account, when it comes to fights, I'd say Oda isn't focused as much on things like choreography or variety, but is more so concerned with the storytelling. That's not to say that other mangaka don't care about storytelling in their fights, just as I'm not saying that Oda doesn't care about drawing cool action panels. All I'm talking about is what his main priority is. What he's thinking is, how can I make this fight demonstrate the theme of willpower in my story? How can I make the story of the fight personalized to my characters? How can I make the ending of the fight a culmination of everything the broader story is about? If you enjoyed this video, then please like, share, and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter for updates on future videos, and you can now support me on Patreon to help me keep making videos like this in the future. All links in the description below. Lastly, shout out to up-and-coming YouTuber Ohara for making the thumbnail of this video. You can check out his channel below as well.